Axis of Islamic Civilization by Ali A. Allawi. Prologue. The Axis of Islamic Civilization. Now on strangers does the world bestow its favors and esteem. All we have been left with is a phantom world and a dream. Muhammad Iqbal, poet and philosopher, writing in his 1909 poem of lament, Shikwa, the complaint, in Shikwa and Jawab-e-Shikwa, translation by Khushwant Singh. There is little doubt that the civilization of Islam is undergoing a monumental crisis. In one form or another, this crisis has been going on for well over 200 years. It still has not worked itself out. Islam as a religion, as a method of worship for millions of believers, is most certainly alive and well. The vitality of the faith is palpable. So is what most people, especially in the West, understand to be Islam nowadays, namely the political and violent manifestation of radical Islam. These are ever present and have caused the rest of the world profound concern and anxiety. When Islam is seen only in terms of the ideology of political Islam, it is not in crisis, but rather one cause of crisis. Both these aspects of Islam, religious observance and political arena, seem to give the lie to the assertion that Islam is in retreat, but focusing on the religiosity of Muslims or on the rise of the political Islam simply deflects or disguises the problem. The world which Islam had built over centuries, its civilization in the broadest sense of the word, has been seriously undermined. How this came about and whether the damage inflicted on Islamic civilization is terminal or not is the subject of this book. Forming a civilization. All civilizations are balanced between individual and the collective or the group, and between this worldliness and the otherworldliness. Shifts between the relative importance of these cornerstones is what gives civilizations their distinctive coloring. Oriental despotisms were built on the glorification of the individual ruler, who was deified and raised above mere mortals. In the Roman Republic, on the other hand, the virtues and the ideals of the society were embodied in group institutions such as the Senate. Roman civilization shifted when the republican virtues turned to imperial grandeur and when the collective wisdom of the Senate was subsumed into the edicts and decrees of an individual emperor. In classical tyrannies, autocracies and despotisms, the will of the individual ruler becomes the determining and the driving force of social action. In the totalitarian communist societies of the 20th centuries, the opposite was the case. Individual will was obliterated by the power of the collective manifested in a party or elite. This is a theory, at least, but often the cult of the supreme leader is superimposed on the collectivist or the corporatist ethos. Now, Stalin and Hitler are just such examples. The modern West, particularly its English-speaking part, is defined by the decisive shift away from the collective and the sacred and towards the individual and the secular. In the self-image of the West, the individual is willed and given the power to determine the course of his or her personal development together with that of the society through the idiom of rights and the practice of a democracy based on the laws and rules. The main purpose of a society becomes to provide the environment for individuals to develop their potential and in the process to enrich and advance the society as a whole. Other modern societies reject the notion that individuals should be the undivided focus of attention. They reverse the formula. The interests of the group, be it the party, clan, the military, or the nation, becomes paramount. Any number of states, including not a few democracies such as Japan and the Scandinavian countries, would tilt the balance towards the collective rather than the individual. Other countries explicitly seek to reconcile and balance the twin and often often conflicting demands of individual and the collective action through a calculus of shared interests. This is the basis of the progressive politics of the democratic left in the Western countries. But such attempts are often short lived as the exigencies of time and places impose the domination of one over the other. The demise of the communal spirit, which has underpinned the post war European welfare state and the social democracy it endangered, is ample proof of this. Post Soviet societies have violently oscillated between a rampant and often criminal individualism and a return to authoritarian hierarchies and structures. Even religions have varied in the way they weigh the individual and the collective. Buddhism is essentially a solitary path to self-realization and fulfillment, while Judaism is eminently concerned with the collective trajectory, spiritual and worldly, of a particular people. At its heart, the Protestant Reformation was about the possibility of the individual, through the acts of personal piety and worship, to attain salvation, specifically without the intercession of a hierarchical church. Most religions interpose a priestly class to act as interpreters and mediators between the individuals and the object of worship. Depending on one's viewpoint, this learned class is either the curse of religions or its essence. Critical disjunctions in human history occur when the individual paradigm is overturned or tilted in favor of the collective, or vice versa. These turnabouts are common in history. A new pattern of values become established, and these continue to color society in until such time as another new set of circumstances forces a change. The precise moments or periods when these transformations take place are never clearly determined. Defeats in wars, famines, and natural catastrophes, economic or financial collapses, generally result in the undermining of the prevailing system, while conquests, discoveries, and material abundance strengthen existing systems, at least in the short term. Such events can affect civilizations suddenly or in long term cumulative process which creates incremental changes, but vestiges of replaced or overwhelmed civilization may continue to exist and interact with the dominant order in ways which are not necessarily antagonistic but which are invariably subordinate. More subtly, however, changes can operate at the individual level, and gradually, progressively, they generate internal forces which overcome the host system. For example, the small but coalescing groups of Christians within the Roman Empire gradually challenged the ethos of the Roman state. By the 4th century, Christianity has established its ascendancy over the old pagan order with the Emperor Constantine's conversion, an outcome which forever marked the destiny of the former territories of the empire. The potential for tension between the individual and the collective is ever present in the modern society. The former generally seeks to maximize his or her autonomy and freedom, while the latter seeks to establish its norms and rules with the power to enforce them. The tensions even inflect the ethical dimension. For example, while individuals pursue liberty, societies may seek social justice. One could conflict with or even contradict the other. An adversarial relationship almost inevitably ensues, which is not always satisfactorily resolved at the political level, even in democracies. The post-war welfare state balance, which allows for individual profit and self-interest but seeks to channel it to social ends through the redistributive power of the state, is a clumsy and often ineffectual compromise between the two elements. The moral imperatives of earlier times, as manifested, say, in the 19th century Christian socialist movement, which sought to focus on the obligation for charitable works and to help the needy through community-based or collective institutions, have faded. The philanthropists of the 21st century bear little resemblance to the great social reformers of the 19th and early 20th centuries. It would be difficult to envisage today's billionaires spending their fortunes on funding experimental or utopian communities such as George Cadbury's Bonneville Village or Robert Owen's New Lanark. Society's concern for the weak and impoverished, briefly shining through a few decades after the Second World War, has been in serious retreat after the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s and thereafter. China appears well on the way to abandoning the collective principles of its formal allegiance to communism, while India, at least its progressive middle classes, appear to be faintly embarrassed by the perceived archaism of the communal ethos of Mahatma Gandhi. Paradoxes of the 1990s. The general drift of the Western world in the recent times has been towards some consensus on the primacy of individual over the collective rights. This has been worked out in the unraveling of the post-war welfare state, as well as the adoption by most of the world of the ideas of untrampled individualism. Totalitarian anti-individual systems such as the Nazi state and the Soviet Empire have been militarily defeated or have collapsed, leaving the field clear for the seemingly irresistible rise of the global civilization. The contours of these orders are defined substantially by the West. The demarcation lines between the public and the private domains have now become increasingly fuzzy. In fact, expanding the sphere of activity of the private sector has become almost synonymous with enhancing the rights of the individuals and the consumers. The functions of the state have been radically recast so that areas which were well within its exclusive remit, such as the provision of health and educational services, pension, public transport, and even defense, became open to the private sector. Even states such as China, which are still officially communal in their ideology, have succumbed to the imperatives of the new order in their drive for economic growth. Witness the official indifference to the appalling conditions in many of the China's factories and the armies of desperate unemployed which roam the China countryside and haunt the margins of its exploding cities. Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek became the icons of the times rather than John Maynard Keynes or Karl Polanyi. The values of the European Enlightenment have been dusted off and given a new leash of life by being conflated with universal rights and values. The process has been accompanied by an aggressive insistence on the correctness and universal applicability of these values. Furthermore, it has become practically axiomatic that these rights and values are defined and achieved only within the context of liberal democracy, a market economy open to globalization, and continuous technological progress. Thus, the sustaining vision of this period is one of mankind approaching the final resolution of the age-old conflicts between the freedom and authority, between religious faith and secularism. The balance would tilt decisively in favor of freedom in all its manifestations, individual, social, religious, and economic. This became commonplace in the 1990s in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But the march towards an end of history and towards a benign symbiosis between the individual and the collective has been severely jolted by continuing and possibly exacerbating tensions between and within societies and individuals. The number of failed states has grown alarmingly, and many of the world's poorest countries have hovered over the brink of disaster, even jumped into the abyss. Liberia, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Burma, Iraq, all mocked the easy assumptions and forecasts of the era. This was also the time when religious passion spilled over into the political arena. The wars caused by a disintegrating Yugoslavia as well as the Chechnya conflict had an overt ethno-religious dimension. Societies which followed the new prescriptions for economic success were faced with increasingly internal economic inequalities and income disparities. In a 2007 report, the Asian Development Bank reported alarming rises in income inequalities in the decade leading to 2005. In 15 of the 21 countries it had examined. Income inequalities in the developed world, especially in Japan, the US, and the UK, also rose markedly in this period. If anything, fragmentation and disorder ended up carrying the day, and demons that one thought would have been long buried or forgotten emerged to increase the sense of chaos and fear. What was seen as the dawn of a new golden age of tolerance and mutual respect turned out to be the harbinger of another cycle of fear and violence. The celebration of individual freedoms and liberties has been short-lived. Collective anxieties about other races, classes, ethnicities, sects, religions, and now entire civilizations, rather than communal solidarity, have replaced the euphoria that accompanied the fall of apartheid and the collapse of the Soviet system. Legitimate self-defense has given way to the doctrine of preemption and prevention. Individual rights to private property gave way to the imposition of the market fundamentalism on downtrodden peoples and nations. The 1990s were full of this whiplash effect. By 2001, the decade that started with such promise had almost reversed itself entirely. At its heart, the tension was elemental between fear and hope, control and freedom, hoarding and sharing, conquest and submission, and it was played out at the level of individuals, groups, and even whole civilizations. A set of elemental forces would predominate was to determine the course of the events on the global stage. In the end, the baser forces have prevailed. The Muslim world was not spared the paradoxes of the 1990s. Individual Muslim countries have, with varying degrees of enthusiasm, joined the globalization bandwagon, easily jettisoning their former allegiances in favor of the new verities, with all their promises and problems. Again, with a few exceptions, they succumbed to the military and political supremacy of the US on the world stage. But Islam, the individual glue which binds Muslim into another set of loyalties and identities beyond the nation, has not yet acknowledged the inevitability of the new world civilization. It is Islam rather than individual Muslim nations that is seen to be at the odds with the rest of the world. The world perspective on Islam has been, in many ways, determined by the state of the other societies, especially those in the West. During the long post-war boom, which ended with stagflation of the 1970s, Western countries were formally indifferent to Islam, except perhaps as an ally in the Cold War. Political Islam has not yet evolved into an intimidating external threat, and the army of Muslim migrants who flooded into Europe in the immediate post-war era to fill low-paying jobs silently accepted their social obscurity and exclusion. The boom times coincided with the rise of the welfare state in the Western democracies. When the socially aware and communal or collective spirit was prevailing, the threat from Islam was hardly ever mentioned, at least not in the present form. The traditional left in the West identified with the causes of anti-imperialism and elevation of poverty in the developing countries and improvement in the lot of the migrant communities in their midst. In both cases, Islam, although mainly a passive bystander, was seen as a potential ally. There were a huge number of Muslims in the developing world, and they formed a significant percentage of the excluded migrants, especially in the Western Europe. The fear of Islam has followed the demise of social democracy in the West and the decay of the socially centered movement in the developing world. The Reagan Thatcher period in the 1980s coincided not only with the anxieties generated by the Iranian Revolution, but also with the controversies surrounding Islam's apparent inability to accept Western freedoms uncritically. This was best exemplified by the Rushdie affair, which poisoned intercommunity relations in the UK as well as in Europe. The 1990s increasingly and often factiously saw a connection between acts of terrorism and the religion of Islam, and also large scale slaughter perpetrated mainly against Muslims in Bosnia, Kosovo, Chechnya, and Gujarat. Let Muslims understand, said a statement by the Hindu nationalist movement RSS, that their real safety lies in the goodwill of the majority. This came not from some crank organization but from a movement whose political arm, the Bharatiya Janata Party BJP, led India's government for 8 years after 1996. It was also the decade when the thesis of the clash of civilization became identified specifically with Islam and its inability to accommodate modernity. The thesis became a truth upheld, even fought for, by a huge swath of groups ranging from liberal columnists in Western Europe to Serbian gunmen ethically cleansing whole parts of Bosnia and mobs whipped up into murderous frenzy by the right-wing Hindu extremists of the RSS in India. The growing tide of antipathy towards Islam reached an apotheosis of sorts after the 9/11 attacks, blocking the pathways of Islamic civilization. History cannot be read, understood, and interpreted according to a fixed set of rules and structures, but every epoch has its own patterns and of explanations. In one epoch, the problem is couched in terms of individual rights, liberties, and freedoms. In another, it is the duty of the individual to the collective. In yet another epoch, nations and their heroes are glorified and assigned almost mythical dimensions. But the temptation is always to consider the verities of a particular age to be universal and valid for all time and place. These renderings, which are frequently pompous and self-congratulatory, then come to define the political culture. They are often carried abroad by the triumphant civilization, and once there, they inflict considerable damage and destruction on the host society and culture. Just think of the call of Commission Civilitris, behind which imperialism hid its ugly face. In an essay extraordinarily titled The Government of the Subject Races, Lord Cromer, the real ruler of Egypt in the years 1883 to 1907, wrote, "We need not always inquire too closely what these people themselves think is in their own interests. It is essential that each special issue should be decided mainly with reference to what, by the light of Western knowledge and experience, we consciously think is best for the subject race. Local modernizing elites to whom power was frequently bequeathed by the departing imperial authorities were equally adept at tearing apart the fabric of traditional societies. The entire edifice of latter-day Islamic societies has been subjected to the shock treatment at the hands of a host of would-be local reformers determined to rescue their societies from powerlessness, poverty, and marginalization. They have drawn on the host of ideologies that promised an easy solution to the Muslims' dilemma, but these have nearly all failed. Another set of solutions are then trotted out, tried as creatives for a diminishing time span, and then abandoned as a lost cause. The procession of forcredited and discarded theories stretches as far as the eye can see. The uncritical of whatever appears to be the prevalent mood in the West is an unfortunate feature of the makeup of the ruling elites in the Islamic world. At the same time, no real attention has been given to the effects of impersonal forces on the world of Islam. These forces have gathered ever greater power since the collapse of the Soviet Union. They often eclipse the power of nations. Commodity, currency, capital, and energy markets are not altogether under the control of nation states, and their movements can have untold effects. Acting under the rubric of globalization, lightly regulated markets, unimpeded capital flows, and financial liberalization, they have increasingly defined the substance of powers. As the gap between what is perceived as the latent potential of the Islamic world and its reality of economic backwardness and political dependency becomes ever more obvious, the siren song of ideologues of political Islam reaches more and more ears. Their image of a pure Islam of old has proven very attractive and not one to be easily forgotten. The temptation when times are dark has always been to imagine a golden age, an Arcadia, or a city on the hill. All cultures and most religious traditions have it. John Bunyan's wonderfully constructed story, The Pilgrim's Progress, can stand aside the Al-Farabi's vision of the virtuous city. And both would appeal to the same desire for uplift, certainty, and a way out of an impossible present. They remain products of a nostalgic, even romantic yearning, and besides being works of literature or philosophy, have little further practical consequence. But nostalgia can be a powerful force and in time can be even turned to quite dangerous ends. All fundamentalisms are, in one way or another, an exercise in nostalgia. They claim to represent the essence, the kernel, and the undivided truth of the idea or the religion, and they promise their adherents a pathway towards certainty and fulfillment. Once in power, all fundamentalists revert to type. Their claims that they can forge a new purpose for mankind and construct a system where the individual and society can grow and prosper invariably fail. A new tyrant arises as the early promise degenerates into a greedy monopoly on power, or worse, descends into chaos and free for all. All these factors have come together in the global preoccupation about Islam. Ever since the Iranian Revolution of the 1979, Islam has been at the center of the world's concerns. The fixation on Islam became even more pronounced after the attacks on 11 September 2001. The religion, the cultures, the civilization of Islam, the Muslim nations, and the people all became the subject of intensive exploration and probing by a huge array of analysts, from the most thoughtful to the most incendiary, from the most illustrious to the most obscure, from the most sympathetic to the most bigoted. Islam seemed to offer the perfect laboratory specimen for exploring what retort on the part of those who supported the legacy of Islam has been mainly defensive and apologetic. An important minority on both sides of the divide has been openly antagonistic. Every incident of terrorist violence has been magnified by some as a clear indicator of the malevolence that lies at the heart of Islam. Every provocative newspaper headline has been pounced on as an example of West's irredeemable hatred for Islam. The crisis in Islamic civilization arises partly from the fact that it has been thwarted from demarcating its own pathways into contemporary life. The Western mold of modernity has been superimposed on its worldview, and Islam has been unable to relate to the modern world except through this awkward and often painfully alien framework. But Islam as a religion, or even as the remnant of a world civilization, has never surrendered wholly to the demands of a desacralized world of modernity. The rearguard action of resistance to the claims of secular modernity has waxed and waned over the past 2 centuries. Rulers over Muslims may behave atrociously, continuing the vulnerable traditions of misrule, violence, and corruption that have plagued the Islamic world for most of its history. But the echoes of what could be still reverberate among the multitude and even among some of the elite. The unease as to where Islamic civilization is heading or is being pushed provides the underpinnings for the stream of projects to reform or revitalize Islam. These have continued uninterrupted from the early 19th century to the present day. They have all relied on the reinventing of Islam by secularizing, liberalizing, historicizing, or radicalizing Muslims' understanding of their own religion. All these schemes have so far failed to stop the erosion of the vitality of Islamic civilization. One can only conclude, therefore, that individual and societal regeneration in Islam has either passed the point of no return or that its roots must be sought elsewhere than in the prescriptions of Islam's would-be reformers. What the reformers or critics of Islam fail to acknowledge is that the spiritual dimension of Islam has imbued the entirety of its civilization. Almost by definition, therefore, any starting point for revitalizing the world of Islam must begin with Muslims' connection with the transcendent reality which lies at the heart of the message of Islam. Regaining knowledge of the sacred is an essential requirement for this. The individual in Islam, within the interpretations of the worldview of Islam, the purpose of all knowledge must be to seek, find, and affirm the divine basis of all right thinking and right acting. The sharp dichotomy between the sacred and the profane, render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's, does not hold in Islam. If it despiritualizes the foundations of both individual and the collective action. Rather than be separate, Islam requires that the two be reconciled. Otherwise, the teachings of Islam affirm mankind would be denying the source of its vitality and would be in the state of perpetual warfare with what ultimately sustains mankind's existence. Mankind's first order of duty must be to acknowledge openly and freely the basic principle which underpins its very existence. This has nothing to do with saving souls, redeeming sins, or rejecting gross material existence. The Quranic text never ceases to admonish and remind mankind that its submission to the decrees of God must form the bedrock for any permanent and permanently valid ethic being and action, a personal ethic as well as the basis for public organization. This is a starting point for all authoritative renderings of Islam, and it has survived the vicissitudes of time and place. It can brook no compromise. All authentic traditions of Islam carry this imprint as they must. It is in this sense that Islam departs from the mainstream of modern constructs of the individual and of the group. In classical Islamic doctrine, the problem of the nature of the individual as an autonomous entity endowed with free will simply does not arise outside the context of individuals' ultimate dependence on God. The Arabic word for individual, al-fard, does not have the commonly understood implication of the purposeful being, imbued with the power of rational choice. Rather, the term carries the connotation of singularity, aloofness, and solitariness. The power of choice and will granted to the individual is more to do with the fact of acquiring these from God at the point of a specific action or decision, the so-called ikhtisab, rather than the powers themselves, which are not innate to natural freedoms or rights. Al-Fard is usually applied as one of the attributes of the Supreme Being in the sense of an inimitable uniqueness. It is usually grouped with others of God's attributes, such as in the formula Al-Wahid, Al-Ahad, Al-Fard, Al-Samad, the one in essence, state, and being, and the everlasting. To establish the absolute transcendence of the divine essence, man is simply unable to acquire any of these essential attributes. Therefore, to claim the right and the possibility of autonomous action without reference to the source of these in God is an affront and is discourteous to the terms of the relationship between human being and God. The entire edifice of individual rights derived from the natural state of the individual or through a secular ethical or political theory is alien to the structure of Islamic reasoning. The individual has a reality, but this is contingent upon a greater reality. None of the free-thinking schools in classical Islamic, such as Mu'tazila, could ever entertain the idea of breaking the God-man relationship and the validity of revelation in spite of their espousal of rational philosophy. Man's ability to reason independently and to ascertain right from wrong and therefore lay claim to autonomous action is ultimately derived from the imperative that God acts justly, does so by empowering man with a faculty of reason. One cannot eliminate God from the equation. Later-day thinkers such as Franco-Algerian deconstructionalist philosopher Muhammad Arkoun have raised the possibility of an alternative Islamic reasoning which could lead to an unraveling of dogmatic orthodoxies and the adoption by Muslims of what he calls the unthought of and the unthinkable. Presumably, this would include accepting and adopting Western notions of the individual, culture, and rights. Even so, the bedrock of any Islamic sensibility must be the textual certainty of Quran as the unaltered and unalterable word of God. Irrespective of how it is read or interpreted, the Quran necessarily introduces the divine into the actions and choices of human beings.